There we have it. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Today we're going to tackle quite a big project. We are pulling out the rear differential and the CV axles out of the back end of the car. So because we're trying to run a little bit more power this year, we will need to have some spare parts for the back end of the car. That being CV axles. When you start to put a lot of torque and stress on those axles, you run a much higher risk of those breaking and causing severe damage. I do not know what size my axles are. I should, but I don't. We're going to pull those out, get an overall measurement, and count on the splines. I believe there's two different styles of the solid axle that I have, a 26 spline and a 29 spline. I don't know what I have. We're going to find that out today. With pulling the diff out, we're not going to be welding it. It's already a welded diff. I did that a couple years ago, but we will be cracking into it and just taking an overall inspection of what the inside looks like after 2 seasons of drifting. We're going to be bracing the diff as well. The wishbone arms that come off and mount to the chassis do need to get braced when putting a little bit more power and torque to the rear end. We will be taking a cardboard template and cutting out aluminum pieces to be able to weld that to the diff. One of the first things we're going to have to do is take the drive shaft out. I have already done that. We also need to drop the back portion of the exhaust out of the car so we have access to the rear diff and the axles. The next thing that you typically will need to do is remove your brake calipers and get those off of the rear hubs so they're out of the way. I already did that as well, and I pulled off the rotors. That's pretty simple. You just need a 14mm wrench and you can pull those calipers out of the way. So after you have your rear brake calipers off of the vehicle, you're just about ready for the next step of the process. The next step we're going to do, we're going to drain the fluid out of the rear diff to make it lighter, and we don't want any fluid potentially leaking out from where the CV axles go into the side of the diff. It's always a good idea before you drain the fluid, make sure your fill plug can come out before you take the drain plug out. If you can't get the fill plug out, it's almost a good idea to just leave the fluid in until you have it out, when you can try and get something better onto this plug to get that out. If you can't get your fill plug out to fill it after you drain it, that causes issues. So now we'll go ahead and drain the fluid out of the rear diff. I've had this done a couple of times. Every year I typically will drain the fluid and then put fresh fluid in before the next season. The size wrench or socket you're going to need to pull out the drain plug. The drain plug is a 24mm, so I have a 24mm socket, and I believe the fill plug is a 23. I don't have a 23, so I'm just going to use the 24. It's just a little bit big, but it's able to catch the teeth and come off. So to save myself a little bit of trouble, I will pull out the fill plug first in good practice, just to make sure that thing can come out. Because I'm using the wrong size, I technically need a 23. I'm going to use a 6-sided 24. Now we're going to take out the drain plug and make sure you got your drain pan available. Now it's only 7 degrees out right now, so it shouldn't come out super fast. There's not really a good way of warming up the diff fluid before draining it out. Just kind of looking at it, there is a little bit of like creaminess to it, but no metal fibers or metal grit, which is good. Okay, so while the diff is draining the fluid out, we're going to move to the next step, which is pulling off the rear knuckles on the car. Before we can pull the rear knuckle off, we need the axle nut off so that the knuckle can actually be removed from the CV axle. You're going to need a 29mm socket and either a big cordless impact and or an air impact. I have the car in gear right now so the axle doesn't spin. We're going to go ahead, try and pull this thing off. I had this side off at one point to do the wheel bearing inside, so this should come off pretty easy on this side. The other side, however, I have not had that off yet. It's pretty rusty looking. It's been soaking with penetrating oil all morning so far, so hopefully that comes off pretty easy. Fingers crossed. The couple of tools you're going to need to pull the knuckle off the rear of the car. For the top bolt on the knuckle, you're going to need a 14mm wrench and a 14mm socket. You could use 2 wrenches if you would prefer, or if you have an impact, that can work as well, but the size you'll need is 14. For the bottom bolt on the knuckle, the actual bolt size is 21 millimeters, and the nut on the other side is a 17. So I'm going to be using a 21 millimeter wrench and a 17 millimeter socket. So like I said before, this has been off fairly recently. I also did a modification to my upper control arms. So if you haven't seen that video, I'll link that below. But it's a 14 millimeter bolt and nut up on the top. So we're going to pull that out. We're not going to pull it completely out because we don't want this just flopping while we're trying to take the bottom one out. So we're going to loosen it all the way up and just leave it sit in there. And then we'll take out the bottom one so that it, again, it's not just flopping all over the place. So we got the nut off. We're gonna leave the bolt in there so it doesn't flop around. Now we'll tackle the bottom. Now, when taking off the knuckle, I've found it easier to fully pull out the bottom bolt before you take out the top one, so it's not tipping down towards you. It just gets awkward that way. And there you go. We got the whole bolt. This goes through both sides of the lower control arm. There's basically two forks that come off and through a cylinder on the bottom of the knuckle. Now that the bottom is free, we're gonna kind of break that loose and then pull out the top one. And this knuckle should just come right out, and the axle should come out with ease out of the back. If it doesn't, you may need to get some sort of a puller to be able to push the axle. And there it is. The knuckle is off the car. Next thing we're gonna do, we're gonna pop out the CV axle on the driver's side from the rear diff using a pry bar or some sort of curl foot that you can kind of stick right inside of here and just kind of give it a little bit of a push if you can find a spot where you can get some leverage. So I also have like a steel rod that I might use to give it a little bit of tap with my hammer. Sometimes these get kind of popped in there and they're pretty snug. And I don't want to shake the car too much while it's on the stands. So we'll see if we can pop it out. All right, there we have it. There is the CV axle for an open diff Miata. It's not open anymore, I welded it, but now we'll set this on the ground. We'll kind of get a good look at this. It feels pretty solid. If this was really sloppy and ishy, then you'd maybe have to look into replacing it before putting it back in the car. But this actually feels pretty good. It's got a pretty safe amount of movement in there, so I'm not too concerned with that. All right, now we're gonna move over to the passenger side. This is the side I have not taken off at all since I've owned the vehicle. So it is a little bit rusty. Hopefully this doesn't take too long to get this side off. The driver's side only took me about 15-20 minutes to be able to pull the knuckle out and get the axle out of the diff. So taking a look at the passenger side, you can kind of see that this nut, the axle nut, is pretty rusty. I don't think it'll be seized on because we have an impact. It should come off pretty well. I had the upper control arm out not too long ago, so that upper bolt should come out pretty easy. And then the lower bolt, also I've been soaking that for quite a while. That should hopefully come out fairly easy. We'll give it a go and hopefully it comes apart pretty easy. If we can get this side done in about 15-20 minutes as well, that'll be only about a total of 40 minutes in just getting the CV axles out. That's pretty good. Well, it's been about 20 minutes of trying to fight this nut, try and get this broke loose. It is not coming off. So instead of like holding ourselves back from getting this diff out, I'm going to take the bolts out of the knuckle and we're gonna pull it out as the CV axle attached to the knuckle, and we're gonna pull it all as one whole unit and then just set it off to the side. I'll maybe end up bringing this to work and get an air impact on this nut because the cordless impact doesn't have enough torque to break that loose. We'll take the bolt out of the upper control arm and we'll get the bottom bolt out of the lower control arm. Oh man, that took a little while. But kind of like what I was saying, there's a lot of surface rust in the middle there. I think all that was just kind of stuck. But I got it out. It does look like this end is a little bent. So maybe the impact on the other side a couple of times has caused damage to this side, which would be pretty extreme, but I could be wrong, but yeah, we got her out. We have the passenger side knuckle and CV axle out of the vehicle. Didn't go quite as planned, but we got it out. I wasn't gonna waste the entire afternoon trying to get that nut broke loose. We'll just bring this whole assembly into work where I have access to an air impact with a high pressure air compressor system. I also don't have an air impact to be able to tackle something like that. So we'll bring it to work, use some big heavy duty tools and get that broke loose. All right, so now that the axles are out of the car, the diff is drained. Now we're gonna tackle pulling the diff out of the car. So what we're gonna do first is get the PPF disconnected from the front of the diff. What is the PPF, you might ask? It is called the PPF because it is the power plant frame. So when we look at it from this side, it is this big channel right here with all those holes in it, goes all the way up to the transmission. There are 3 bolts up there, 2 of which need to come completely out, and 1 we're just gonna loosen up so that we can take these 2 bolts out back here and just kind of pivot that off to the side so the diff can drop down around it. All 5 of those bolts that are on this PPF are 17 millimeter. So we'll go ahead, take out the 2 up front and loosen that bolt, and then we'll pop these 2 out of here as well. The one has a nutsert on the top of the PPF that it threads into. That one is pressed in there with splines. And then there's also like a nutsert deal on the bottom that helps locate it into the bottom of the diff. I actually shaved mine off in there to make it easier to get on and off. If you've never taken these off before, you'll find out it's a little tricky with that in there. You basically have to try and bend that down and around it to get that off of the diff. So when you look at these 2 bolts, the front one has like a step down on it. The back one is just one solid bolt. So don't mix those up. I mean, it can only go in one way, but I like to keep them separate, set them off to the side in the location that they're supposed to go in. Now that we got it all loosened up, we're gonna shove a pry bar right up inside of here and pry it off of the diff. Now we got that kind of popped off to the side, and that shouldn't really go anywhere. So we'll leave it just like that. Now we'll move on to dropping the diff. So we're laying on our back right now, head towards the front of the car. We got this side of the diff, this is the passenger side. The big bolt is a 17, and then we have to take out these 2 12 millimeter bolts as well. So 17, 2 12s, and then you go to the other side, and you got a 17 and 2 12s. So first what we're gonna do is take out the 2 12s on both sides. Then we're gonna loosen up the 17s, but not take them all the way out. Otherwise your diff will just fall on you. And we don't want that to happen. So what we're gonna do, take out the 2 12s, loosen the 17s, and then we're gonna kind of go off to the side, put a jack underneath here, and support the center, like the main weight of the diff, and then take off the bolts little by little until that diff can kind of start to teeter, and we'll drop it down on the jack. Alrighty, we got it loose. Now we're just gonna kind of carefully wiggle it out and down out of the car. Hold back here, slowly lower it. Tighten up the jack a little, get it worked out of the PPF. Now, if I remember right, I did have to get this brace out of the way to be able to get the wishbone portion of the diff out. I don't think you have to do that. We'll be able to work it to one side and kind of turn it and get it out. Well, I'm kind of struggling getting this diff out because of the tube that braces up forward above, like basically underneath the subframe and up to the front where it mounts to the frame rail. So I'm just gonna cut that out again. I cut it out when I welded the diff originally like 3 years ago. So I'm just gonna cut it out again and I'll weld it back in place, no big deal. Again, just like the nut on this side, I'm not gonna waste any more time. I'm cutting it out of here. there's our diff. When we take a look at the back side of the diff, where I'm talking about bracing this thing is basically from the main shell all the way out to where the mounting points are. So this whole arm is just aluminum, so is this back part. It's cast aluminum back here. And then the front, where the pinion gear and the main ring gear is, it's all up in this cast iron portion. So it is cast iron, half cast aluminum. We're gonna weld on some aluminum plates basically from out here all the way in. I'm actually thinking about making one whole long piece that goes all the way across and is gonna tie around this whole section. Get that bad boy set up there. I already brushed off some of the debris and stuff. There's some CV grease on the bottom of this arm. We're gonna kind of just wipe off real quick. And then we're gonna take some measurements real quick, write it all down, and record it, and then we'll take a piece of cardboard, trace out where the measurements are, cut it out, and try and place it over in as like a cardboard animated design to then transfer that to my aluminum piece that I have at work waiting to get welded to this. So that's about what we got. This is the first kind of sketch. We're gonna trim this out with the scissors real quick and then test fit it on the diff. I'm gonna cut a little bit wider than the line and then we'll trim up if we need to. Alrighty, there's our first piece. We'll slap the diff back up here on the table and we'll give it a test and see if this is about the right shape. All right, we'll get a little bit of a test fit here. It is bigger than it's supposed to be, but as of right now, it looks like it's gonna basically match, like the length cut, like lengthwise this way is correct with it being bigger than my marks. So I think we'll maybe leave that alone and we won't trim the length this way, but we will have to trim it so it's smaller. We'll give a little trim around the actual housing here, still on the outside of the line, just to give us a little bit of wiggle room if we have to trim it some more. Basically right on the outside of where the blue line is. So we've still got some room to come in. But I do have to come up quite a bit up on this side here. I need to go basically here, up about 1/8 of an inch. About like that. So that it'll drop into place on the bottom here. But I think there's not enough material on this bottom. But as long as I can get it tied in here, I think it should be fine. We're almost there. Just gotta trim up a little bit more up here. Just working this one section is actually pulling it together pretty well. Now, I will have to trim a little bit off this bottom section. So I like how it sits down here and up top, but the bottom needs to be trimmed. Basically right here to right here. Almost have to come up about 1/4 of an inch. That's gonna work. There's a little bit of gaps here, but we'll be able to fill that and that won't be any problem. So yeah, that's about what we need. I mean, if it's not completely perfect, I'm okay with that. We can massage that onto the actual piece when the time comes. So now, in theory, we should be able to flip this over and it should match up with what we need, the same on this side. And it does. So, there we got it. Now we just need to get a long enough piece to where we can trace this whole piece as one, and then we'll kind of lay it all out and kind of fine tune that as well. So now we gotta find a bigger piece. All right, so now that we have this piece of template, we need to stretch it so it's basically mirrored on the other side. We're gonna grab a bigger piece of cardboard and get that right now. There we have it. We got this bigger piece. Now we're gonna test fit it on the diff to make sure this is gonna match up with what we need. If it doesn't work, we can use this other template or readjust this just a little bit, because I left it so there's a little bit of wiggle room so it can hug around the actual pumpkin of the diff and match up with the arms. So we'll kind of set this up here. I kind of didn't really know how I should trace it on here, if it needed to be pitched a little bit. So right now, if you line up the one side, the other side points way too far up. So I angled it just a little bit. So when I cut this out of the aluminum piece, I will have to make sure that I pinch it down. I drew a couple of arrows here real quick to make sure it can hug around the actual pumpkin of the diff. So that shouldn't be a real big issue. I did cut this piece bigger than the actual like tag board template, just to make sure that when I do cut it out of the aluminum, I can always shave it down a little bit to fit how I need around the diff. So the next step we're gonna do a little bit of grinding and prep work on the diff, so that when we bring it to work, all we have to do is cut the aluminum piece and then weld it onto the diff. So I don't know if it's just me, but anytime I use power tools, I get a little carried away. Drop a comment down below if you do the same kind of stuff. When you get your hands on a power tool, you just go with it. I went a little bit too far and pretty much polished the aluminum on the rear housing of the diff. It's definitely prepped for welding, which is good, but I think I got a little carried away with the wire wheel and just had at it, because basically the entire thing is polished. I mean, you can see it's really shiny. Whoops. So anyways, we have this all prepped for welding. That's basically all we're gonna do for today. The next step is to take it to work, get the aluminum cut out, and weld it to the diff. Thanks for watching this episode. Stay tuned for part 2.